Welcome to DIYeasycrafts.com. Today we're going to take a look at how to cast in clear resin without any bubbles and without using a pressure pot or a vacuum chamber. Now we're going to cast seashells, which are inherently a little bit difficult to cast because of all the air pockets. And I'm going to show you how to do this two ways. Utilizing standard craft casting epoxy, which you can get down in the local arts and crafts store, and then with using a really good epoxy, and show you just how different it is and how much easier it is with that better epoxy. So I tried a variety of different epoxies and different techniques, and always ended up with quite a few micro bubbles in the resin, which really gives it a milky look. It's not crystal clear, definitely not usable for the majority of the arts and crafts projects that I wanted to do with it. So these are the little secrets or tricks of the trade that you have to do. You have to warm the object that you're going to cast. Doesn't have to be hot, just has to be warm. Doesn't want to be ice cold. If you're going to try to cast wood, that wood really should be stabilized, and I have a separate video on that. You have to slowly stir the epoxy, not fast. You have to pour in layers. You have to agitate the bubbles and get them to the surface, and then pop those bubbles. And then the last, like I mentioned before, is to use a better epoxy. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. This is the first casting that we're going to do is with Arts and Craft casting epoxy. I'm going to clean the surface. You saw that I warmed the seashells. I just did that with a hairdryer. This is a piece of wood burl that I'm going to use for another project. I cleaned that with a wire brush. You're going to mix and stir as per the instructions on the particular epoxy that you have. Some are mixed by weight, some are mixed by volume. You don't want to aggressively stir like I'm doing here. You know, the bottle doesn't tell you that. It says that, stir 3 minutes or stir for 8 minutes. But when you stir quickly like this, you add micro bubbles into the mix. The trick is to slow for the duration that they want you to stir for, but very slowly. And look at the difference. There are still some micro bubbles in here, but there's no comparison. Same resin, the one on the left is stirred slowly, the one on the right is stirred quickly. Note how thick this resin is, all right? The thicker the resin is, the harder it's going to be for those bubbles to find their way to the surface. You want to slowly pour the resin in from one side. A lot of people will use a pressure pot, and a pressure pot would compress those micro bubbles to a point where they're microscopic and you wouldn't see them. Other people use a vacuum chamber, and the vacuum chamber does the opposite. It actually makes those bubbles larger so that they have time to float to the surface and you can then pop them. We're not going to do either of those techniques. We're going to, after we pour the resin in, we've got our shells in there, we're going to pop whatever bubbles come to the surface. And you can do this with a pin or a knife. But if you look real close, we've still got some micro bubbles in that mix, deep into the resin. We don't have a lot of time with some of these resins. The set time is pretty quick. So we're going to want to agitate that a little bit. One method that I found that works, so not only do you want to pop the bubbles that are on the surface, is use a hairdryer, but use it on cool. So we're not really warming the resin, we're just moving the resin around, agitating it, and giving those micro bubbles a chance to get to the surface. You also want to pour in layers. You don't want to pour real thick. The thicker the resin, the more material those bubbles have to travel through in order to get to the surface. Using the arts and craft type casting resin, you do have to maintain a little vigilance over it during the drying process. So you have to return every 5 or 10 minutes and pop whatever bubbles have gotten to the surface. I like using these little butane lighters, and they can very quickly pop any of the bubbles that come to the surface. You don't want to heat the resin up too much with it. You're really just very quickly passing over it and popping those surface bubbles. So now I've agitated it with the hairdryer on cool. I've gotten most of those micro bubbles that were deep into the resin to the surface. And I keep going back with the butane lighter, just popping whatever microbubbles have made its way to the surface. And then when this layer gets tacky, then I can add another layer of clear over that so that all of the shells are completely covered, and then basically do the same process. And the end result is pretty good. So I've got a nice clear casting. There's few, if maybe even no, bubbles in the casting itself. Very, very acceptable. And this can be used for a lot of different arts and craft type projects. In fact, I've got a number of them scheduled. Now, the last trick is to pick an epoxy that's more appropriate. I found this Totalboat thickset epoxy and absolutely love it. The difference is it's a very thin epoxy. So the bubbles won't get trapped or stuck in a thick epoxy. They make their way to the surface very easily. It also has a very long cure time. So instead of racing the clock and trying to get everything done within 15 minutes before epoxy starts to cure, this epoxy, I let it sit for 24 hours before I can even think about taking it out of the mold. You do want to slowly stir it like we did before. On this particular casting, I'm going to use sand on the bed. So I'm just putting a thin coat of the Totalboat thickset epoxy down, and then I'm going to add some seashells to that. My thought was I kind of cement those seashells in place with this first layer, and then I'll pour more clear on top of that. So I can wait until that gets tacky before I pour that second coat of clear. So these are the seashells that I'm going to add. I'm making these actually for knife handles. I make custom knives as a hobby, but you could make nautical coasters, drink coasters, a variety of different things with seashells and clear casting resin. So that first layer is tacky. Now I'm going to pour the second layer on. I'm going to pour it from one side and let it kind of flow throughout the mold. And because this resin is so thin, it's very easy for those bubbles to make their way to the surface. And because it's got such a long cure time, it's got plenty of time for those microbubbles to make their way to the surface. So really, all you have to do with this one is just pop the surface bubbles every once in a while. And the end result is really spectacular, especially when you consider that we did not use a pressure pot and we did not use a vacuum chamber. So this is the end result. I hope you enjoyed this quick little video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. By all means, check out our website, www.DIYeasycrafts.com. I've got a variety of nautical related do-it-yourself projects on there. Again, thank you very much for watching.